So glad you're joining us for this Sip and Talk. I'm Joe.
Hey everyone, good to be here.
Today, we're diving headfirst into something that's, well, it's been all over the headlines, hasn't it? Feels huge, maybe a little distant for the escalating tensions in the Middle East.
Yeah, definitely dominating the news cycle.
But you know what? This isn't just some far-off conflict. It actually has some surprising impacts that, believe it or not, can reach right into your wallet. And interestingly, it might even offer some pretty important lessons for places like Taiwan that face their own unique kinds of threats.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the news has been incredibly intense lately, and trying to wade through it all, figure out what's actually going on behind those headlines, it can feel, well, overwhelming. There's definitely a lot of conflicting information flying around out there.
Absolutely. So our mission today for you is to help unpack these recent events. We want to cut through some of that noise, the conflicting info, and try to get a handle on the actual military realities of what went down.
Right, the facts on the ground.
Exactly. And then zoom out a bit, see how this whole situation connects to the bigger global dynamics. We're talking information warfare, which is fascinating, the economic ripples that, hit everyone, and maybe some critical strategic lessons others can learn.
It's all about getting a clearer picture. Yeah, cutting through the fog.
Precisely. Helping you get a clearer, more grounded picture of these really complex situations. So, let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this. We saw some pretty significant military action just recently, right? Specifically around June 13th and 14th, 2025.
Yeah, that was pretty intense. What we saw was this really large-scale attack from Iran targeting Israel. They're calling it a saturation attack, I think.
That's the term, yeah, saturation attack. It really gives you a sense of the strategy. It's not about hitting one or two specific spots with, pinpoint accuracy.
Right, not like a sniper shot, more like a shotgun blast.
Kinda, yeah. It's about overwhelming the defenses by throwing a lot of stuff at them all at once, from different directions. In this case, we're talking multiple waves, missile strikes, drone strikes. Reports indicate over 100 ballistic missiles and drones were launched.
Over 100. Whoa.
Yeah. And the targets included major Israeli cities like Haifa and Tel Aviv, so population centers.
Okay, over 100 missiles and drones coming in. That sounds like a massive wave. How on earth did Israel even try to defend against something on that scale?
Well, this is where Israel's much-discussed multi-layered defense system really came into play. You got to think of it like layers, maybe like different kinds of nets designed to catch different types of fish,
Okay, layers. Like what?
They rely heavily on systems like the Iron Dome. That's their go-to for the shorter range threats, rockets, smaller drones, that kind of thing.
Right, Iron Dome. You hear about that one all the time.
Exactly. Then there's the Patriot system, which is designed more for the medium to long-range stuff, like ballistic missiles. And they have other layers, too. David's Sling for the medium range, the Arrow system for the really high-altitude, long-range ballistic missiles. It's a whole stack.
So a whole defensive toolkit. How well did it work against such a huge attack? I mean, did they stop everything?
Well, according to the Israeli military's own reports, their defense system had a remarkably high success rate. They stated that the vast majority of those incoming missiles and drones were intercepted.
Vast majority.
Yeah. The Iron Dome, which, historically has this incredible success rate, like around 90% against the kind of threats it's built for, it was definitely working overtime. And the Patriot and Arrow systems, they were tackling the faster, higher-flying ballistic missiles.
Okay, but you said vast majority. That implies not everything was stopped. Some things got through.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's a really critical detail when you're looking at how effective these defenses really are under pressure. While the system performed, excellently overall against that sheer volume, it wasn't like a perfect hermetic seal. Some missiles did manage to get through those layers and actually hit targets.
Okay. What kind of damage are we talking about?
We saw reports of a hit on a residential area in Haifa. Tragically, that resulted in at least 5 deaths, dozens injured. Another area near Tel Aviv also saw hits, property damage, casualties there too.
So even one of the most advanced defense systems in the world, when faced with a large enough saturation attack, can still have breaches. That's sobering.
It is. And the type of weapons used really matters here. There were indications that Iran used some more advanced weapons in this particular attack, including something called the Fatah-1 hypersonic missile.
Hypersonic. That sounds fast.
Extremely fast, like 5 times the speed of sound or even more. And unlike traditional ballistic missiles that follow a predictable arc, these things can maneuver in flight. That makes them a major challenge for current defense systems. Getting through with weapons like that, well, it definitely posed a significant challenge to those defensive layers.
Okay, so Iran launches this big, kind of messy, multi-wave attack. Mostly stopped, but it did cause some tragic damage, especially with maybe some advanced weapons getting through. What was Israel's response then? Did they hit back?
Oh, yes. Israel followed up pretty quickly with what are being described as highly precision strikes. Very different approach. Unlike Iran's tactic of just overwhelming volume, Israel focused on hitting specific high-value targets inside Iran.
Precision strikes. Like what specifically? What kind of targets did they decide to go after?
The targets were clearly strategic. Reports mentioned key Iranian infrastructure, things like the Shiran oil depot, a big fuel storage facility down in South Tehran. Now, Iranian officials claim they contained the fires quickly, but the full extent of the damage, well, it wasn't entirely clear from those initial reports.
So hitting economic infrastructure, fuel supplies.
Yeah.
But they also went after something much more sensitive, didn't they? Something that really ups the ante.
They did. And this is where Israel really demonstrated a different level of capability, you could say. They hit targets directly linked to Iran's most sensitive programs and its military leadership. Reports confirm strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities.
Whoa. Nuclear facilities.
Yeah, specifically mentioning key enrichment sites like Natanz and Fordo. These are like the nerve centers of Iran's nuclear program.
That's huge. That's not just hitting infrastructure. That's striking right at the heart of what Israel sees as Iran's biggest potential long-term threat.
It is. And it's a major escalation target, no question.
Yeah.
Beyond the nuclear sites, they also struck specific military targets, and this resulted in the deaths of key figures, including senior commanders in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Taking out commanders.
Yes, reports explicitly mention the death of Commander Salami, among others. Targeting top military leadership like that suggests, well, really deep intelligence penetration and the capability to carry out incredibly precise strikes on high-value human targets.
Okay, let me see if I've got this straight. The initial exchange, Iran throws this large, kind of messy punch, lots of missiles, drones, mostly blocked by Israel's defenses, but it still landed a few painful hits, caused casualties.
Right.
Then Israel responds, not with volume, but with a much more targeted, precise counterpunch, hitting critical infrastructure like oil depots, hitting sensitive nuclear sites, and taking out top military leaders.
That's a pretty solid summary of the direct military actions, yeah. And the way this whole conflict is being described now by analysts, it's pretty stark. They're calling it a real war.
A real war. I mean, they've had tensions, skirmishes, proxy fights for ages. What makes this different? Why call it a real war now?
It seems to signal a real shift in the dynamic. It's moved beyond those proxy conflicts or, limited, maybe deniable exchanges by directly attacking each other's territory, hitting critical assets on this kind of scale. While neither side can easily back down now without looking like they've been defeated, that's both to their own people and, on the international stage.
Okay, so the stakes are just fundamentally higher now. They've crossed some serious lines that are really hard to uncross.
Yeah.
It feels like a point of no return, almost.
Exactly. That whole concept of red lines, it's been tested before, definitely. Actions like targeting senior commanders in the past or nuclear scientists. But with these direct strikes on cities, on nuclear facilities, taking out top military leadership on this scale, those lines seem to have been not just tested, but maybe completely erased.
What were the official justifications? How did each side frame what they were doing? Why did they say they did it?
Well, from Iran's perspective, their big attack was justified as severe punishment. They framed it as a direct response to what they see as previous Israeli aggressions, specifically mentioning the targeted killings of their commanders, like Commander Salami, and also pointing to earlier attacks on their nuclear facilities.
So payback, basically.
That's the narrative. It's worth noting, though, that while Iran's public rhetoric often calls for, the destruction of Israel and the U.S., analysts looking at this latest attack point out that their actual military capacity, as demonstrated here, seemed pretty limited. The effects were less strategic than maybe they hoped for.
Okay. And Israel's justification?
Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu was quite clear. He stated his objectives were basically to destroy Iran's nuclear program and its military capability. He even went so far as to issue calls for the Iranian people to overthrow their own government. So you have these profoundly opposing goals driving the conflict. Makes de-escalation incredibly difficult, right?
Yeah. Hard to find common ground there. Okay. So looking purely at the military results, the hits, the misses, the interceptions, what's the overall assessment of this exchange? Who, militarily speaking, came out looking stronger, based purely on what happened in those couple of days?
Well, analyzing the immediate outcome, most assessments really point towards Israel demonstrating military superiority in this specific exchange. Their multi-layered defense systems, the Iron Dome, Patriot, Arrow, they performed remarkably well against that huge saturation attack. They intercepted the vast majority of incoming threats. That really showcased their technical and tactical edge in air defense.
So their shield held up pretty well despite the volume.
It did. And Iran's attack, despite the sheer numbers involved.
Yeah, what about that?
Well, while it was significant in volume, it ultimately had limited precision. It failed to inflict truly strategic damage. Yes, it caused tragic casualties and damage, absolutely. But it didn't cripple Israel's infrastructure or its military command or its strategic capabilities in the way a truly successful, devastating attack would have.
So the big, messy attack didn't really achieve its core strategic goals. What about Israel's precise counterstrikes? Did they achieve their goals?
Israel's precision strikes, on the other hand, are generally seen as having significantly weakened key aspects of Iran's military and nuclear capability. I mean, hitting active nuclear facilities and killing top commanders, those are major blows. They'll have tangible impacts on Iran's programs and their operational capacity going forward. So this exchange, based on the analysis, seems to have solidified Israel's, quote, dominant position, at least in the immediate aftermath.
But you mentioned earlier the risk of this whole thing escalating further is still really high. It's not over.
Oh, absolutely not over. Despite that assessment of Israel's tactical dominance in this round, the underlying tensions, the stated objectives, the animosity, none of that has gone away. There are reports mentioning Iran claiming they're planning a counterattack that's 20 times stronger.
20 times stronger. Is that even feasible?
Well, whether they realistically possess the capability to execute something like that is highly debatable among analysts. But the very threat itself keeps tensions absolutely boiling. It raises the specter of a much wider regional conflict, which is what everyone is worried about.
Okay. Fascinating from a military angle.
Yeah.
And also, incredibly concerning for the region and beyond. Now let's pivot slightly, because as you mentioned, this conflict isn't just fought with missiles and drones. How it's talked about, the narrative spun around it, that's a whole other battlefield, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this brings us to a really important point about information warfare, and specifically a claim that really stood out, one that got a lot of attention.
Which claim was that?
The claim that Iran can destroy Israel in half an hour.
Half an hour, seriously? That sounds unbelievably fast, almost like science fiction. I feel like I might have heard that floating around somewhere, maybe attributed to some commentators, possibly in China.
Yes, exactly. That claim was notably attributed to certain Chinese commentators. Individuals like Professor Li from China's National Defense University were mentioned in connection with it.
Okay, let's tackle that claim head on. Based on everything we just discussed, the actual military capabilities shown, the recent exchange, the defense systems, is that half-an-hour claim even remotely realistic?
Well, putting it bluntly, analyzing the military realities we just covered, the idea that Iran could destroy Israel in 30 minutes is seen as a massive, massive exaggeration of Iran's actual military capability. Experts looking at the data state, there's a really significant gap between that kind of claim and the reality on the ground.
Okay, why? Why is it so unrealistic? Break it down for me. What makes it propaganda, not possibility?
Well, okay, let's look at Iran's capabilities again. Yes, Iran possesses thousands of medium-range ballistic missiles. They can reach Israel. But the critical factors here are accuracy and the sheer quantity you'd need to completely destroy a country's core infrastructure in just 30 minutes.
Right. Hitting isn't the same as destroying everything.
Precisely. And look back at that earlier attack in 2024. Iran fired around 200 missiles then. Reports confirmed a staggering 99% of those were intercepted by Israel and its allies. 99%.
Wow. Okay, a 99% interception rate against 200 missiles really puts that half-hour destruction claim into pretty stark perspective right there.
It really, really does. And then you have Israel's defenses. We just detailed that multi-layered system, Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, Patriot. These systems working together have shown extremely high interception rates against the types of threats Iran possesses in quantity.
And it's not just missiles, right? Israel has other advantages.
Definitely. Beyond missile defense, Israel has a highly advanced air force, including those F-35 stealth fighters. They have a significant intelligence advantage, which was clearly shown by their ability to carry out those precision strikes on specific leaders and facilities. Now, yes, Israel is a small country, limited strategic depth, that's a challenge. But its military is fully prepared, highly trained, technologically advanced, and crucially, it possesses an undeclared nuclear deterrent. That's a powerful ultimate backstop.
What about Iran's allies? Their proxy forces, like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas. Couldn't they launch attacks that would contribute to overwhelming Israel?
That's a factor, but analysts note that Iran's primary proxy forces are currently under significant pressure themselves. They've suffered heavy damage from recent Israeli actions. Hezbollah's leadership has been systematically targeted over time. Hamas has sustained substantial losses in Gaza. So while they can still launch attacks, cause trouble, absolutely, these groups lack the overall capacity, the coordination, the advanced weaponry needed to achieve anything close to the kind of total destruction against Israel implied by that half-hour fantasy.
And Iran's own nuclear program isn't weaponized yet, right? That's still the assessment.
That's correct. According to public intelligence assessments, Iran's nuclear program has not yet produced a usable nuclear weapon. And as we discussed, those recent Israeli strikes on key facilities like Natanz likely represent a significant setback to any progress they might have been making towards weaponization.
Okay, so when you factor in Iran's actual missile numbers versus their accuracy, Israel's highly effective layered defense shield, the weakened state of the proxies, and the fact Iran doesn't have a ready nuclear weapon. Yeah, that half-hour claim just completely falls apart under scrutiny.
That's the conclusion you reach based on military analysis, yes. The half-hour claim isn't grounded in realistic military capability. It's being described much more accurately as, well, propaganda rather than any kind of objective assessment.
Propaganda. Okay, that leads directly into another really interesting observation that comes out of looking at these events, this significant gap in information that seems to exist, particularly between the information circulating within China domestically and what's being reported or understood in the rest of the world, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like this Middle East conflict and these exaggerated claims of Iran's military prowess.
Yeah, this is where you really see how different information environments can almost create different realities, can't they? The way events are reported and framed within China, particularly on international issues that have geopolitical implications, it can diverge quite significantly from how those same events are reported globally.
Can you give us a really clear example from these recent events, something concrete?
A perfect case study is that claim about Israel's advanced F-35 fighter jets. Remember those?
The stealth fighters, yeah. What was the claim?
Well, on June 15th, 2025, Iran specifically claimed they had shot down multiple Israeli F-35s. They even claimed they captured a pilot. Some international wires picked up reports mentioning Iran claiming 2 F-35I Adir jets were shot down back on June 13th.
Okay, so Iran puts out this huge claim taking down one of the most advanced, supposedly near-invisible fighter jets in the world. That would be a massive deal. How did Israel respond to that?
Israel's response was immediate and pretty unequivocal. They strongly denied the claim. Officials flat out called it completely baseless fake news.
Okay, so you have two completely opposite stories. Iran says we shot down F-35s. Israel says absolutely not. What's the reality based on independent verification? Did anyone else confirm Iran's claim?
Well, as of the time analysts were looking at this, no. No independent international sources, not other governments, not independent military analysts, not international news organizations with reporters on the ground. None have been able to verify Iran's claim. It remains completely unsubstantiated by any credible third parties.
Okay, unsubstantiated. Now, how does China's media, maybe state media like CCTV, fit into this picture of an information gap we were talking about?
This is where that geopolitical alignment becomes a really key factor. China's state media outlets, including major ones like CCTV, tend to present information in a way that aligns with China's overall foreign policy interests and its international relationships.
And China and Iran have a friendly relationship, right?
They do. They have what they call strategic cooperation. They engage in significant oil trade. Iran's part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, which China leads. So, given this friendly relationship, when reporting on the conflict, state media like CCTV might, for example, emphasize or give prominence to Iran's claims like shooting down F-35s without necessarily giving equal weight to, or perhaps even mentioning, the strong Israeli denials or the crucial fact that these claims lack independent verification.
So they might amplify the part of the story that makes their strategic partner look good or makes their partner's adversary look bad, even if that part of the story is disputed or totally unproven.
That's the dynamic that's often observed, yes. And you can see how this connects right back to that half-hour claim we were discussing. These kinds of exaggerated claims, which aren't supported by objective military analysis, might get amplified within certain media circles or by specific commentators because they serve a purpose. They bolster Iran's position. They reinforce a broader narrative that might serve China's geopolitical interests, maybe portraying Western military technology as vulnerable, or highlighting perceived weaknesses of countries aligned with the U.S., like Israel.
And it's made even harder for ordinary people inside China to maybe get a more balanced view because of internet controls, the Great Firewall, right?
Yeah, the firewall is a huge part of this information landscape. China's extensive internet controls restrict access to most foreign news websites, BBC, New York Times, Reuters, you name it, or international social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook, where you might find those balancing viewpoints, see the Israeli counter-arguments, or read analysis from independent global sources.
So if you wanted to just quickly check what, say, NBC News was reporting about the Israeli denial, you probably couldn't easily access that site from within China.
For most people, no. It's difficult without specific tools like VPNs, which themselves face crackdowns. This essentially creates a much more centralized, almost a single-source information environment for many citizens, especially regarding sensitive international news. It makes it really challenging to access perspectives that might challenge the official line or the state-approved narrative.
Are there other factors that contribute to this gap, this discrepancy in information?
Yeah, several other things play a role. There's simple media selectivity outlets choosing to highlight specific bits of information that align with the desired narrative, or maybe stir up nationalistic sentiment. For example, focusing heavily on the number of missiles Iran launched, because it sounds impressive, while downplaying or burying the fact that 99% of them were intercepted.
Cherry-picking the facts.
Exactly. You also have commentators whose motives might be more about, getting clicks, gaining attention, or pushing a specific political agenda rather than conducting rigorous data-driven analysis, sometimes presenting sensational claims without solid evidence to back them up.
The loudest voices aren't always the most accurate.
Precisely. And unfortunately, there's also the effect of prolonged reliance on limited information sources. Over time, it can reduce people's inclination, maybe even their habit, of questioning official narratives or actively seeking out alternative viewpoints. You get used to accepting the information you're given.
Okay, so for you, listening right now, trying to navigate this world where information can be so different depending on where you are, where you get your news.
Yeah.
How can you try to recognize these information limits? How can you attempt to get a more accurate picture, especially on complex international stuff like this?
Well, based on the analysis, there are a few practical things you can try to keep in mind. First, just try to recognize information singularity. Ask yourself, is this the only perspective I'm hearing? Am I only seeing one side's claims of victory or success? Or am I getting a fuller picture that includes the counterclaims, the denials, the independent assessments from outside the conflict?
That makes sense. If the story sounds a bit too perfect, too one-sided, maybe raise an eyebrow and dig a little deeper.
Exactly. Second, if you possibly can, try to seek multi-party verification. Now, this might be difficult depending on your location and internet access, we know that. But if it's feasible, check different sources, reputable foreign media outlets, reports from international organizations, analysis from established independent think tanks or experts. See if their reports align or if they contradict what you're hearing. Even within a restricted environment, sometimes comparing different domestic sources can reveal subtle differences, omissions, or changes in emphasis.
Right. Try to triangulate the information if you can. Don't rely on just one source.
Precisely. Third, really question exaggerations. Claims like destroy a country in half an hour are extreme, right? Be skeptical of sensationalism, of hype. Ask for the concrete data. What are the actual numbers involved? What are the technical specifics of the weapons? What are the real capabilities versus the stated goals or the propaganda claims?
Data often cuts through the hype, doesn't it?
It really does. Fourth, try to understand the geopolitical context. Remember that media reporting, especially from state-controlled or state-influenced media, often has a bias. That bias is shaped by national interests, by alliances, by rivalries. Knowing a country's relationship with the players involved in a story can help you understand why that story might be presented in a certain way.
Like knowing China and Iran are friendly helps explain why Chinese media might emphasize Iran's claims.
Exactly. And the final piece of advice, maybe the most important, Just try to cultivate critical thinking as a habit. Don't just passively absorb information, especially online or on TV. Be an active reader, an active listener. Ask questions internally. Is this plausible? What evidence is missing here? Who benefits from me believing this narrative? Just being wary of any single information source, especially on complex, charged international issues, is absolutely crucial in today's information environment.
That's incredibly valuable advice for anyone just trying to make sense of the world today. Okay, moving on. This conflict, like so many others in the Middle East, it doesn't just stay contained within the region, does it? It sends these ripple effects out around the world. And one of the most tangible impacts for you and me is often felt directly in our wallets.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Geopolitical tension, especially boiling over in a region so vital to global energy supply like the Middle East, it has immediate economic consequences. And energy prices, gas prices, that's usually the first place we see it.
How exactly does a conflict flaring up over there translate into higher gas prices or maybe more expensive groceries for someone living halfway across the world? What's the mechanism?
The main mechanism is really fear of supply disruption. The Middle East is just a massive global supplier of oil and natural gas. And it contains these absolutely critical shipping lanes, the Persian Gulf, especially that narrow choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, and also the Red Sea passage. When conflict escalates, markets get extremely nervous about these vital routes being threatened or disrupted or even blocked entirely.
So it's not necessarily that the supply is cut off right now, but the fear that it might be cut off soon.
Exactly. That uncertainty, that fear about future supply is enough to drive speculation and push prices up. And the analysis points to specific data from these recent June 2025 events. Following that Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, Brent crude oil futures, that's a key global benchmark for oil prices, they jumped significantly by 14% at one point.
14%. Wow, that's a huge jump in a short time.
It is. And NYMEX WTI futures, another important benchmark, also rose, hitting $68.15 per barrel. And of course, high oil prices. Well, they trickle down into almost everything, don't they?
Yeah, seems like it. How so?
Well, higher oil prices mean higher costs for transportation across the board. Think ships carrying goods, planes flying cargo and people, trucks delivering everything to stores. That increases the cost of bringing raw materials to factories and getting finished goods to the market. Plus, industries that use oil directly as an input manufacturing, chemicals, plastics, they see their production costs rise too. All these increased costs. They often get passed on to consumers, you and me, contributing to broader inflationary pressures globally.
So everything from the cost of getting something delivered online to the price of stuff in the grocery store shelf goes up. Okay. What about the financial markets, like the stock market? How do they react to this kind of geopolitical tension?
Financial markets are notoriously sensitive to geopolitical risk. They hate uncertainty. When tensions flare up like this, it makes investors nervous. They tend to become more risk-averse. What does that mean? They pull money out of assets they see as more vulnerable, like stocks, and maybe move it towards things considered safer, like bonds or gold. This outflow of capital from the stock market leads to declines.
Did we see that happen after this June 2025 escalation between Iran and Israel?
Yes, the analysis notes that global stock markets generally fell in response. The Dow Jones Industrial Average saw a drop of about 1.8%, the S&P 500 was down over 1%, and the tech-heavy NASDAQ dropped about 1.3%. And it wasn't just U.S. markets. Markets in Asia also reacted negatively, partly due to the sell-off in U.S. futures, and partly because those rising oil prices hit their economies directly too.
Okay, so stocks generally down. Are there any sectors or specific companies that actually benefit from this kind of situation? Heavy winners in all this?
There can be, yes. Energy stocks often see gains. Why? Because higher oil prices generally mean higher revenues and bigger profits for oil companies. So major players like ExxonMobil, Chevron, maybe Saudi Aramco can see their stock prices rise.
Makes sense. More expensive oil, more money for oil companies.
Right. And interestingly, this kind of conflict, by highlighting the vulnerability of traditional energy supplies, can also increase interest and investment in new energy and alternative energy sectors. People start thinking more about energy security, energy independence. So companies involved in solar, wind, electric vehicles, maybe like Tesla, SolarEdge, Delta Electronics, they might see increased investor interest.
Okay, so traditional energy and maybe some alternative energy get a boost. Who are the big losers then, besides, the average person filling up their car or buying groceries?
Well, the most directly hit sectors are usually transport and airlines. Companies like American Airlines or FedEx, their fuel bills just skyrocket, right? That severely impacts their profitability. Shipping companies, too, like Evergreen Marine Corps, they face not only higher fuel costs, but also the risk of route disruptions if things get really bad in those waterways.
Yeah, shipping must get complicated fast.
Definitely. And beyond that, companies that rely heavily on consumer spending can suffer. That includes many retail businesses, consumer goods companies, even parts of companies like Tesla that sell expensive cars directly to consumers. Why? Because the inflation fueled by high energy prices eats into people's disposable income. They have less money left over after paying for essentials, so they cut back on non-essential purchases, big-ticket items.
So it's a squeeze on consumers, which then flows through to hit the businesses that depend on that consumer spending. Are there any other significant economic pressures we should be aware of?
Yeah, the analysis points to broader impacts across the economy. Industries like manufacturing, chemicals, steel they face cost pressures, not just from oil as a direct input, but also from the increased cost of transporting their materials and products. And demand for things like travel, tourism, dining out often decreases as consumers become more cautious with their spending in uncertain times.
And doesn't all this make the job of central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve much, much harder? They're trying to control inflation, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a major headache for them. High oil prices are a significant driver of overall inflation. They work directly against the efforts of central banks trying to bring rising prices under control. If oil prices stay stubbornly high because of geopolitical tension, central banks might feel forced to keep interest rates higher for longer than they would otherwise want to.
And higher interest rates slow down the economy.
Exactly. Higher rates mean increased borrowing costs for businesses looking to invest and expand, and for individuals trying to buy homes or cars. That can slow down economic growth significantly and potentially increase the risk of sliding into a recession.
And the sort of worst-case scenario for the global economy in this context, the thing markets really dread, would be a direct impact on those critical shipping lanes, right? Like the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, that's the big one, yes. The analysis really highlights that significant supply chain risk. If the conflict were to escalate to the point where we saw attacks on oil tankers or a serious attempt to blockade vital choke points like Hormuz, well, that could trigger another, potentially much larger surge in oil prices. And it could cause severe, widespread disruption to global supply chains, throwing international trade into chaos. The economic consequences of something like that are difficult to predict precisely, but they would likely be very, very negative.
Okay, so we've covered the military reality on the ground, the fascinating and kind of scary information battleground, and how it all translates into these economic impacts that pretty much everyone feels eventually. Now, let's shift focus again and ask a really critical question, especially maybe for listeners interested in global security and other potential flashpoints.
Yeah.
What can places like Taiwan learn from all this? Taiwan faces its own potential threat of a missile saturation attack, right? But this time from China. Can they draw lessons from Israel's recent experience defending itself?
Yeah, this is a vital strategic comparison that's being looked at very closely. Israel's recent, largely successful defense against that Iranian saturation attack offers some very specific, tangible points for Taiwan to consider as it refines its own defense strategy against a potential similar, though likely much larger scale, attack from the mainland.
Okay, so what are the key takeaways from Israel's defense model that seem most relevant for Taiwan's situation? What did Israel get right?
Well, the absolute core lesson that jumps out is the proven effectiveness of having a truly multi-layered integrated air defense system. As we discussed, Israel successfully deployed its different layers. You had Iron Dome handling the low-altitude, short-range stuff like rockets and drones, David's Sling for the medium-range threats, and then Patriot and the Arrow system dealing with the higher-altitude, longer-range ballistic missiles and aircraft.
And their performance back in June 2025 against that big Iranian attack really demonstrated that effectiveness, didn't it?
Precisely. Intercepting over 100 missiles and drones, coming in multiple waves, minimizing casualties, preventing catastrophic strategic damage. That was a powerful real-world demonstration of what a well-integrated, multi-layered defense can achieve, even against a large-scale volume attack.
But you also mentioned the limits, right? Some stuff got through.
Yes, and that's a crucial part of the lesson, too. It showed the limits. Some of those more advanced missiles, possibly hypersonic ones, did seem to penetrate the defenses. It highlights that even the most advanced systems available today are not a perfect impenetrable shield, particularly when facing cutting-edge offensive weapons used in a saturation scenario. Perfection is probably unattainable.
Okay, so the goal is a robust, multi-layered, integrated system, understanding it might not be 100% perfect, but aiming for maximum effectiveness. How does Taiwan's current air defense capability stack up against that Israeli model? What do they have now?
Taiwan definitely has a foundation, but the comparison reveals some pretty key differences, both in the structure of the system and, importantly, its density. Taiwan operates its domestically produced Skybow missile series, the Tiankung systems. Those are designed to handle medium to long-range threats, including ballistic missiles and aircraft.
The homegrown systems. What else?
They also have U.S.-made Patriot Pass-3 systems. Those are highly capable, focused on short to medium-range defense, and they're strategically deployed, particularly providing vital protection around the capital, Taipei, and key military bases. Older Hawk missile systems are still around but are being phased out.
And are they trying to develop something like the Iron Dome for the smaller stuff?
Yes, there are plans underway to develop something often referred to as a steel dome, basically. Taiwan's indigenous equivalent to the Iron Dome, specifically designed to counter short-range rockets, artillery shells, and drones. They also have some offensive missile systems, like the Xiongfeng anti-ship missiles and Thunderbolt rockets, which might have some limited utility in a counter-missile role, but that's not their primary design.
Okay, so they have various types of systems covering different ranges. But what about the density? That seemed key for Israel. Does Taiwan have enough of these systems spread out effectively to handle a truly nationwide saturation attack?
Density is absolutely a critical factor, maybe the critical factor, when you're talking about defeating saturation attacks. An analysis comparing air defense density, usually measured in something like interceptor units per square kilometer, reveals some significant differences. Israel has a very high density, estimated somewhere around 4 to 6 units per 100 square kilometers, with particularly dense coverage layered around major cities and critical infrastructure.
4 to 6 units. Okay, how does Taiwan compare?
Taiwan is assessed as having a medium to high density overall, perhaps estimated around 1 to 2 units per 100 square kilometers. But, and this is but this density is heavily concentrated in the north, protecting Taipei, governmental centers, key military facilities. That leaves other large parts of the island, central and southern areas, significantly sparser in terms of high-end air defense coverage compared to Israel's more comprehensive blanket.
And other countries for comparison?
South Korea, for example, is often cited as having a medium density, again, very dense around Seoul, but less so elsewhere. Ukraine's density, of course, is highly variable and critically dependent on the flow of Western aid. It's concentrated where the fighting is fiercest.
So the takeaway for Taiwan is strong points, especially around the capital, but potentially large areas of the island might be relatively exposed compared to Israel's broader, denser coverage.
That's a key point emerging from the analysis, yes. Taiwan's defense network is geographically concentrated, and it doesn't currently possess that fully integrated, truly nationwide, multi-layer network that Israel has spent decades building, a network that includes not just the interceptors, but also the sophisticated real-time radar pre-warning systems and the high-speed command and control network needed to fuse all that data and direct interceptions effectively during a massive, complex attack.
Okay, this leads directly to the huge question that Taiwan is constantly grappling with. Can it actually withstand a large-scale Chinese saturation attack? What kind of threats would China likely even use in such a scenario?
Well, China possesses a formidable and incredibly diverse missile arsenal. A saturation attack against Taiwan could involve a whole range of weapons used simultaneously. You're talking short and medium-range ballistic missiles, like the DF-15 and DF-16, which are numerous and based close by. Cruise missiles like the CJ-10 flying lower and harder to detect. Potentially large-scale drone swarm attacks using hundreds or even thousands of relatively inexpensive drones to overwhelm defenses.
Drones too. Why?
Absolutely. And increasingly advanced hypersonic missiles like the DF-17, which present that speed and maneuverability challenge we talked about. There's even speculation about the possibility of disguised attacks, maybe using rockets initially presented as civilian satellite launches or weather rockets to achieve surprise. It would likely be a multi-vector attack, coming at Taiwan from many angles, altitudes, and speeds all at once.
That sounds incredibly challenging to defend against. It's the complexity alone. So, based on the analysis, what are Taiwan's biggest current challenges in facing that kind of nightmare scenario?
Several key challenges are consistently highlighted in these analyses. First, as we just discussed, that lower overall nationwide interception density compared to Israel. It makes it inherently difficult to guarantee defense against simultaneous high-volume attacks hitting multiple parts of the island at the same time.
Not enough interceptors everywhere they might be needed.
Potentially, yes. Second, system integration. While Taiwan has made progress in linking its systems, they're not yet fully networked for that kind of seamless, instantaneous communication and shared radar picture needed to coordinate defense effectively during a massive, chaotic attack. Delays in communication or sharing targeting data between different systems could be critical.
So the different parts might not talk to each other fast enough.
That's the concern. Third, there's a noted lack, at least publicly known, of large-scale, full-spectrum saturation attack simulations or live-fire tests that would truly gauge how the entire integrated system performs under the absolute peak stress of such an attack. It's hard to know for sure how it will hold up until it's truly tested.
And fourth, just the sheer strain on resources and manpower. Defending against simultaneous attacks, hitting the north, central, and southern parts of Taiwan would place an immense burden on the available defense systems, interceptor stockpiles, and the personnel operating them. Sustaining that defense over time could also be a major challenge. Okay, so given these significant challenges, what concrete steps or policy strategies could Taiwan realistically pursue to strengthen its air defenses? What can they do, taking lessons from Israel, Ukraine, and others?
The analysis suggests several key areas for focused improvement. One is definitely accelerating the development and deployment of that local Iron Dome equivalent. Taiwan has plans, as we mentioned, for a short-range close firepower network designed specifically to counter those low-level threats like rockets, artillery, mortars, and drones, likely using integrated radar, automated gun turrets, and maybe even dedicated drone interceptors.
So building up that lower layer of defense.
Exactly. And pursuing technical cooperation, perhaps with the U.S., or even potentially learning from Israel's experience, could speed up the fielding of this absolutely vital lower-tier defense layer. It plugs a current gap.
Makes sense.
Another crucial step is significantly expanding and integrating the national radar network. This means not just relying on dedicated military radar, but finding ways to integrate data from civilian radar systems, maybe from the state oil companies' facilities, civil aviation towers, weather bureaus, harbor authorities, knitting it all together with military radar to create a comprehensive, unified pre-warning system covering the entire island and its approaches. Maximum warning time is critical.
More eyes everywhere, all feeding into the same picture.
Precisely. Early and comprehensive warning buys crucial reaction time. A third strategy involves enhancing civilian preparedness and resilience. This includes developing a user-friendly public air raid warning app, something similar to Israel's successful Red Alert app, to get warnings out to the population instantly via their smartphones.
So people know immediately when to take cover.
Right. And alongside that, significantly increasing the number, quality, and accessibility of underground public shelters, especially in densely populated urban areas. Boosting civilian resilience is a key part of the overall national defense posture. It's not just about military hardware.
So public involvement, physical shelters, making the whole society more resilient, that's part of the defense picture too.
Absolutely, it has to be. And finally, a fourth key area is accelerating the integration of artificial intelligence, AI, into air defense command and control systems.
AI, how does that help?
Well, learning from how AI is already being used or experimented with in places like Ukraine and Israel for things like rapidly analyzing missile trajectories, predicting impact points, distinguishing real threats from decoys, and automatically prioritizing which incoming targets pose the greatest danger, and assigning the optimal interceptor that could significantly improve Taiwan's system response speed and overall efficiency, especially when facing hundreds of threats simultaneously. AI can process that complex data faster than humans.
Okay, so combining better hardware, like a local Iron Dome, better integration, linking all the radars, smarter software using AI, and greater public readiness and resilience. Bringing it all together then, what's the overall assessment of Taiwan's defense position based on this comparison with Israel and the threat it faces?
Well, Israel's recent experience clearly demonstrates that a robust, well-integrated, multi-layered defense system, when coupled with real-time warning systems and effective civilian cooperation and resilience, can achieve very high success rates, even against large-scale saturation attacks. It shows it's possible.
So there's a model that works.
There is. Taiwan definitely has a solid foundation in air defense technology and personnel. But the current analysis suggests that at this moment, Taiwan cannot guarantee full interception or confidently minimize damage against the kind of high-density, multi-vector saturation attack that China is potentially capable of launching.
So they have capable systems, but maybe not enough of them, not spread out enough and not fully integrated yet to be truly confident against the full spectrum of China's potential attack capabilities.
That seems to be the realistic assessment presented in most independent analyses, yes. And this is often framed within the context of the CCP's political rhetoric and deterrence, messaging those recurring claims about being able to take Taiwan in 24 hours, or achieve a swift victory. The conclusion drawn is that Taiwan's response shouldn't be based on either panicked exaggeration or complacent denial, but rather on a calm, realistic assessment of its current capabilities and vulnerabilities, followed by concrete, urgent actions to build genuine, credible security and deterrence. It's about focusing on the real work needed.
Okay, that was a really thorough look at the military specifics and the crucial lessons for Taiwan. But stepping back and looking at this whole complex picture, the Iran-Israel exchange, the information war, the Taiwan comparison there, are even broader implications and some really knotty questions that surface, aren't there? Things we haven't even touched on yet.
There absolutely are. And they touch on some really complex, sometimes uncomfortable areas. For example, the analysis we looked at brings up what it describes as the moral and legal gray area surrounding the use of the so-called precision strikes.
Wait, what makes precision strikes morally or legally ambiguous? I thought the whole point was they're better because they avoid hitting civilians, right? Isn't hitting military targets preferable?
Well, on the surface, yes, the intention behind precision strikes is often stated as minimizing civilian harm, which most would agree is morally preferable to indiscriminate attacks. But the deeper question raised is, does the precision of the strike automatically make it legal or moral if it's launched preemptively against another sovereign country's territory? Especially if it's done without a clear, universally recognized legal justification, like immediate self-defense against an attack that's already underway.
Okay, so it's about the justification for the strike itself, not just how accurate it is. How does international law even try to address this? Is there a rule book for this?
International law, particularly the UN Charter, Article 51, clearly addresses the right to self-defense if an armed attack occurs. It's pretty clear. But the concept of a preemptive strike, hitting someone first because you believe they're developing the capability to attack you in the future, or because you think an attack is imminent but hasn't actually started yet, that's much more legally debated and controversial.
So striking first is the gray area.
It's a big one. Countries like Israel and the United States have, at times, argued for the legitimacy of preemptive or preventative strikes under certain narrow circumstances, maybe citing intelligence about an unavoidable future threat. They might point to examples like Israel's 2007 strike on a suspected nuclear facility under construction in Syria. But there's definitely no broad international consensus that says preemptive strikes are okay under international law. It remains highly contested.
Okay, here's a thought experiment then for you listening right now, based on this legal and moral ambiguity. Imagine if Taiwan, facing what it credibly assesses as an imminent, massive saturation attack preparing on the Chinese mainland, decided to launch its own precision strikes against those specific missile facilities on the mainland before they could launch. How would the international community react? Would that act be viewed through the same lens as Israel's strikes on Iran? Or would it be judged completely differently based on who is acting and against whom? It's a really complex question about how legitimacy and legality are perceived and applied in the real world, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And this ties directly back into the information warfare and narrative control we were discussing earlier. Why is it, the analysis asks, that in international media coverage, actions by certain countries might frequently get framed using words like restraint or measured response or legitimate self-defense, while very similar actions taken by other countries might be immediately labeled as aggression or illegal attacks?
So the narrative, the story told about the action, shapes how it's seen and judged globally. Maybe even more than the action itself.
It plays a huge role, absolutely. Think about Iran's saturation attack. Domestically, it might be successfully framed as just revenge for past grievances, a necessary response. But in many Western narratives, because of its nature large-scale, hitting new civilian areas, the sheer volume it's presented as an indiscriminate, almost terrorist-style attack. Information warfare is absolutely crucial in shaping the perceived legitimacy or illegitimacy of actions taken during a conflict. And the analysis explicitly asks, is the CCP observing how this plays out, how narratives are built and contested, and learning lessons for its own potential future scenarios?
China has definitely faced international criticism over its narratives regarding sensitive issues like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and its intentions towards Taiwan. Are these narrative challenges, these failures to convince the international audience, partly due to maybe a less sophisticated or less effective international information strategy compared to countries like the U.S. or Israel?
That's a fascinating question raised in the analysis. The U.S. and Israel are often described as being particularly skilled at what's called narrative prepositioning. That means effectively building the justification, the context, the framing for potential future actions well in advance through public diplomacy, media engagement, intelligence releases, and so on. This prepositioning can make those actions seem more understandable, maybe even more acceptable, internationally when they eventually occur. Perhaps China hasn't mastered this aspect of global information strategy as effectively yet.
And you can't ignore the role of social media in all this narrative warfare, right?
Oh, absolutely not. Social media is a massive factor now. Videos, images, personal accounts, memes, coordinated campaigns, they spread instantly and can be incredibly powerful in shaping perceptions. They've essentially become another weapon used alongside traditional military hardware in these modern conflicts. Controlling the narrative online is critical.
It really feels like the technology aspect of modern warfare is just accelerating incredibly fast. We talked about Israel's advanced military tech, and the analysis links some of that progress to close military technology sharing with the United States. Does the U.S. ever worry about where that highly sensitive technology might eventually end up? Could it leak?
The analysis does raise that as a potential area of ongoing concern, yes. Israel has made truly significant advances in military technology in areas like missile defense, cyber warfare, AI applications, drone technology, partly thanks to very close, long-standing cooperation and technology sharing with the U.S. However, there's always an underlying question, a risk assessment, about the potential for some of that sensitive technology or the knowledge behind it eventually leaking to other parties, maybe through espionage, maybe through allies who aren't as careful, perhaps even through captured equipment or reverse engineering. It's a constant balancing act for the U.S.
And is China actively learning from others in this global military tech race? Maybe not just from the U.S. or Israel, but from countries like Iran or Russia, especially in areas like drone warfare.
That's another really important point highlighted in the analysis. Is China observing and actively absorbing tactical lessons and maybe even technological insights from, say, Iranian or Russian drone operations? The analysis specifically mentions the Iranian Shahed 136 drone. That's the relatively cheap but effective suicide drone that Iran has supplied in large numbers to Russia for use against Ukraine. There are real concerns about the potential transfer or leakage of that drone technology itself, or at least the tactical knowledge gained from its widespread use, potentially finding its way to China.
This whole situation really puts a bright spotlight on the kind of ethical dilemma of military technology globalization, doesn't it? It just spreads.
It absolutely does. Who is producing these increasingly sophisticated and lethal weapons? Who is using them? Against whom? And perhaps most importantly, who is monitoring their proliferation and trying to ensure they don't end up in the hands of rogue states, non-state actors, or used for purposes that violate international humanitarian law? It's a huge challenge. The analysis even touches on concerns about how dual-use civilian technologies, things like commercially available drones from companies like DJI, which are ubiquitous now, might be relatively easily adapted or used for military intelligence gathering or even weaponized. The lines are blurring.
Okay, let's think ahead again, maybe to the day after. What happens after a major conflict like this, especially if one side suffers really severe damage? If, hypothetically, the infrastructure in Iran were significantly degraded, or as some extreme rhetoric might put it, if the country were somehow sent back to the Stone Age, who steps in? Would the international community mobilize to rebuild? And crucially, who would foot the bill for that massive reconstruction effort?
These are absolutely critical, yet often overlooked post-conflict questions. They have massive practical, economic, and ethical implications. The analysis raises this hypothetical scenario and the fundamental question of responsibility. Who takes responsibility for rebuilding shattered infrastructure, for supporting displaced populations, for restoring basic services in a devastated country? And it also highlights the potential downside risk for the country perceived as the military winner. Would Israel, for instance, face a significant international backlash, accusations of excessive retaliation, or even find itself being pressured to bear some of the financial burden for subsequent reconstruction efforts in Iran?
Has there been a historical precedent for that kind of situation where the winner faces pressure to rebuild the loser?
Well, the analysis references the example of 2006. After Israel conducted extensive strikes in South Lebanon in response to Hezbollah attacks, it faced international criticism and accusations related to reconstruction responsibility for the damage inflicted. It underscores the point that achieving a military victory on the battlefield is often just the beginning of a long, complex, and costly process. There are significant political, economic, and social consequences that extend long after the actual fighting stops.
Does the U.S. experience maybe offer lessons here too.
It does. The analysis implicitly asks if the U.S. experience in Iraq, where a swift military victory was achieved, but ensuring long-term stability and managing the immense costs and challenges of reconstruction, proved incredibly difficult and protracted, serves as a kind of negative lesson. A lesson about the potential pitfalls and long-term burdens that can follow even a decisive military outcome, the challenge of winning the peace after winning the war.
Finally, let's just briefly touch on the psychological aspect of all this. We talked about Iran's saturation attacks. Were they purely military in their objective, do you think, or was there perhaps a domestic political motive at play as well?
That's a really interesting question the analysis poses. Was Iran's large-scale, highly visible, and widely publicized attack partly intended to transfer domestic pressure? Facing significant economic hardship due to sanctions, dealing with internal dissent, launching a dramatic attack against a major external enemy like Israel could be seen as a way for the regime to try to rally nationalistic sentiment, deflect criticism from its own performance, and maybe distract the population from pressing internal problems. It's a classic political tactic.
And flipping that, what about Israel's response, those precise, effective strikes? Was that also partly aimed at their own population, sending a message domestically?
It certainly suggested that Israel's precise, technologically sophisticated, and apparently successful response could also serve an important domestic purpose. It acts as a demonstration of the government's competence, its strategic thinking, its intelligence capabilities, and its ability to protect its citizens effectively from external threats. This can reinforce domestic confidence in the country's leadership and its military, which is crucial in a high-threat environment.
And there's always pressure on leaders in these situations, right?
Absolutely. The analysis touches on that risk for political leaders on all sides, the intense political pressure, the fear of being perceived by their own public as not tough enough or as having failed to respond adequately to an attack. That fear can significantly influence decision-making during a crisis. And once again, social media plays a huge role here, with videos, narratives, and online sentiment being used as powerful psychological tools in this ongoing battle for public opinion, both at home and trying to influence opinion abroad.
Wow, okay. That really gives you a comprehensive, almost 360-degree view of how incredibly interconnected all these different factors are. You've got the raw military action, the high-stakes information war, the tangible economic ripples spreading globally, the vital strategic lessons for other regions like Taiwan, and then these deeper, complex legal and ethical questions bubbling underneath. It's crystal clear that what happens in one corner of the world can and does have consequences pretty much everywhere.
Absolutely. If we try to sort of tie this all together, connect it back to the big picture for you, we saw the stark military reality of the recent attacks. Israel's highly effective, multi-layered defense managed to counter the bulk of Iran's large-scale saturation attack, limiting the strategic damage despite some inevitable breakthroughs. That technical and tactical superiority was evident in this exchange.
Right. And we really highlighted that critical difference between information landscapes, especially contrasting the narratives often found within China's domestic information environment regarding these events with the reporting and analysis available elsewhere. It's a powerful reminder of how official narratives can significantly diverge from objective reality and the importance of seeking diverse sources.
And we looked at the very real, very tangible economic impacts that ripple outwards and affect everyone. From the immediate jump in oil prices fueling inflation that hits your pocketbook, to the resulting volatility shaking global financial markets. These aren't abstract geopolitical games. They have real-world financial consequences for individuals and economies worldwide.
And crucially, we discussed those complex, vital lessons that a place like Taiwan, facing its own unique and significant threats, can potentially draw from Israel's defense model. We assessed Taiwan's current air defense capabilities, its strengths and weaknesses, and explored potential strategies for strengthening its position against the specific threat of a saturation attack from China.
And finally, we delved into some of those broader, often tougher, strategic and ethical considerations that these events bring to the surface. The legal gray area surrounding the initiation of precision strikes, the constant pervasive battle for narrative control in modern conflict, the unsettling implications of global military technology proliferation, the often unaccounted for long-term costs and responsibilities that follow conflict, and those powerful psychological games being played to shape public support, both internally and internationally.
It all paints a picture of a really complex, interconnected, and frankly pretty volatile world.
It really does. And maybe this all raises a really important final question for you to think about as you wrap up this Sip and Talk with us today. Given this incredibly intertwined nature of military technology, information control, economic stability, and national resilience that we see playing out so clearly in the Middle East conflict and its global impacts, how prepared are other nations that might be facing similar threats?
Yeah.
And perhaps thinking more personally, how prepared are you to navigate this increasingly complex global landscape? A landscape where sometimes it feels like the truth itself is just another battlefield.
That is a powerful thought to leave you with after unpacking all of that today. Thanks so much for joining us for this Sip and Talk.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. It was great discussing this.
And hey, before you go, seriously, you should definitely check out our old friend Micky's YouTube channel. No joke, it's a blast. He's got tons of fun memes, really great music picks, some entertaining wine tasting videos, and cool travel vlogs from all over. It's seriously fun stuff. You got to check it out.
Absolutely. Worth a look. See you next time.
See you next time.